good artists copy while great artists steal, at least according to Picasso, and apparently also according to World War II German engineers and scientists. Did you think that it was the Germans who invented the Goliath? Wrong. When talking about World War II UGVs, or unmanned ground vehicles, the German Goliath is probably the most famous one. Little known fact is that the Goliath wasn't a German design, nor was it really a German idea. It was a French idea, the same French who already had this idea 20 years earlier, back during the early days of World War I. Not too far into World War I, the French realized that there isn't going to be very easy ways to break the impasse of trench warfare. Artillery is often too inaccurate and also has to reveal itself when firing, and massive infantry charges across no man's land are very costly and aren't always very successful. At one point, they realized, what if we just have a remote control bomb that drives up to enemy fortifications, relatively accurate compared to artillery, can blow up without any sort of warning, and then we can pour men into this opening in the fortifications that we have created and hopefully, break through. And their idea is these things called land torpedoes. So this Crocodile land torpedo is actually very aptly named. It was made so it could traverse no man's land, so they sealed all the electrical components inside of the Crocodile, basically allowing it to drive along the bottom of a crater filled with water and come out on the other side. It was a relatively small machine, but did carry about 40 kilos of explosives, which would have been enough to blow a pretty decent dent in some of the German trenches and fortifications. The downside of the Crocodile was that it was wire guided, which meant that as it traverses no man's land, in no way obviously a beautifully flat landscape, there's a huge chance that a barbed wire next to cable or a piece of wood or really anything stops the machine from being controllable by the operators. The two engines on board were not only capable of just moving it forward, if you disabled the engine on one side, it would technically allow it to be sort of rudimentary steered, and then finally, once it had reached its hopeful destination, they would use the same wire to give it the detonation command. So on July 15th, 1915, the Crocodile is shown to some French army observers, and they are so excited about this idea that they immediately say, give us a whole ton of these. However, about a year later, the Crocodile is taken out of production as the French army sees more in armored vehicles that will not explode upon reaching their destination. The tank can keep supporting them, whereas the Crocodile would blow up and it would be a one-time use thing. So the French army of the 1930s figured, we're going to be fighting Germany again at some point soon, and we want to preempt their defensive lines. Didn't happen, by having a new UGV, much like the World War I Crocodile, and they came up with a design that was called the Pommellet. So the French army actually ordered 2,000 pieces of the Pommellet, which was a massive device. And if you look at the future Goliath, which would carry about 60 kilos worth of explosives, the Pommellet could carry 300 kilos. The interesting thing about the Pommellet is that it is not wire controlled, but actually radio controlled. So seeing the French army's interest in the Pommellet and seeing or hearing that there's 2,000 of these being ordered, a different designer by the name of Adolphe Kégresse, the same guy who sort of invented the half-track, said, well, let me make a different device that's completely different in basically every way from the Pommellet, and I'll try to showcase it to the French army because, hey, I want to make some money with my design. So unlike the Pommellet, this is not radio controlled, but is again controlled with wires, but it does have a 1.5 kilometer range and only carries about 60 kilos worth of explosives, whereas the Pommellet carries about 5 times more, but it's in a lot smaller chassis. The French army actually sees prototypes of this doing stuff on the proving grounds. They order 12,000 of these. So by the time that the Germans actually invade France in May 1940, only 11 of the 2,000 ordered Pommellets have been finished. Also basically means that the Kégresse never sees more than just a couple of prototypes made because the French army ordered these right before the invasion began. So as the Germans blitzkrieg through France, Kégresse and his team are ordered, or maybe at their own accord, destroy a whole bunch of the documentation of their device, but some of the prototypes are still around and they decide to dump them into the River Seine, though it's not very long, a couple months later really, that German soldiers discover the prototypes in the Seine, fish them out, and send them back to Germany, where the Borgward company will take a very good look at this and create the Goliath remote control bomb. If we go back in time a couple of months from the German invasion of the Low Countries in France, we'll actually find out that the Wehrmacht had already put in some requirements with different German companies, as they wanted a remote controlled heavy mine clearing device that would either use its own weight or a roller behind the device to clear minefields, as they expected there to be quite a bunch of minefields as they headed into France and perhaps other countries in Europe. So in 1939, the Borgward company actually came out with the B1, which was a very heavy remote controlled device which carried a roller behind it, the idea of just sending it through a minefield and hopefully the roller would explode the mines. Not too long later, the Borgward company sort of comes out with the B2, which removes the roller, and the whole point of the device is to blow itself up in a known minefield and hopefully taking a whole bunch of the enemy mines with it. The Borgward company built the B1 and B2 really as mine clearers, and not more than maybe 100 or so were built in total between the two of them, but it wasn't until they got their hands on the Kégresse prototype that they decided to, hey, we can use this differently, and that's when the Goliath is really born. So initially, the Goliath, nicknamed the Sd.Kfz 302, comes with 2 electrical engines, though it's later refined and given a petrol engine and then assigned the name 303. It has a 650-ish meter range, comes with a pretty cool sort of hanging remote from your neck with a giant joystick on it. It's wired much like the Kégresse, and it's still equipped with about 60 kilos worth of explosives. However, the German army, after using it in trials and in combat, still thinks it's too big, though it's relatively small, especially compared to the Pommellet, and a lot of them actually get disabled as they make their way to the target. So the Borgward company initially had the B1 and B2, and then in 1942 they built the B4, and the Borgward 4 was such a massive vehicle compared to the Goliath, big enough to where a driver could physically sit in it and drive it towards an area of operations, and then switch over to remote control right at the end for its final objective. However, that objective was a little less final than the Goliath's like self-destructive ways, because potentially the Borgward could drop a massive bomb and then drive away from it, thus being able to be reused if the enemies didn't completely shoot it out of existence on the way there, on the way back. But that was maybe more of an economical boon for the Germans, who really needed to sort of keep as much of their devices intact, especially as they were nearing the end of the war. The German army wants to replace the Goliath and the Borgward with a new device, and the German NSU company comes up with the Springer in late 1944, and only like 50 of these are made between late 44 and the end of the war. And it's based on the sort of motor half-track called the Kettenkrad. So much like the Borgward 4, this actually had a driver's seat capable of basically driving it to its location. It could be equipped with over 300 kilos of explosives, which is like 5 Goliaths worth, and could also be used in both wired or radio control, I guess depending on the situation and the time they had to set it up. As I was doing research for this video, I came across something I had never heard of before, but I guess they use these in very small numbers on the Eastern Front, more specifically around Crimea, against Soviet positions in 1942. Obviously, the British as well as the Soviets lost some Bren carriers to the Germans. The Soviets obviously through Lend-Lease, the British through the campaign in 1940 in France and the whole Dunkirk fiasco. They were turned around, loaded with explosives, over 400 kilos worth apparently, and about 30 of them were sent at Soviet defenses near Crimea in 1942. And allegedly of these 30, 8 of them actually reached their goals and exploded, being a pretty smart way of getting rid of these stolen vehicles, because you can't really maintain them, you might not have the right tools or equipment, so let's turn them around, fill them with explosives, and send them at the enemy defensive line.